Hi everyone, my name is Emily Pedrazi. Today's topic will be using principles of learning in AP Psychology. A lot of this will be just how to apply it in the real world or just some nice review. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or reach out to me if you're watching the replay. Before we get started, make sure to follow @ThinkFiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube for updates on cool AP stuff and streams, all that kind of good stuff. Moving into what we have coming soon. So on the 17th of November at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have Other Types of Learning. Then on the 20th at 8 p.m., we have the Unit 4 Free Response Question Practice. And then moving into Unit 5, we have a presentation on memory on the 25th at 8 p.m. And in this stream, the stream itself will be covering a review of conditioning, just to make sure that you have the ideas down. Conditioning in clinical settings, or additional settings such as classrooms and personal day-to-day life. And the last topic is just how to condition yourself, just some fundamentals and how to apply it to the real world. So as a review, we have some classical conditioning terms. You might see UCS as US. Either way, it stands for Unconditioned Stimulus, which is a stimulus that naturally creates a response. And we can be going into Pavlov's dog pretty soon to apply a scientific experiment to this. Then following the UCS, we have the UCR, or the Unconditioned Response, which is a natural response to the unconditioned stimulus. On the contrary, we also have the CS, which is the conditioned stimulus. It's conditioned to have a reaction due to a UCS. Like it's used side by side. Then we have the conditioned response, which is a response that you've learned from the CS. And we'll actually have an example of that in just a second here. Oh, it'll load. There we go. So before the conditioning in the Pavlov dog experiment by Ivan Pavlov, we have the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. Dogs will naturally have a reaction to that. So they'll start salivating immediately, which is the unconditioned response. Nothing was tampered with in this interaction. That's just how it is naturally. It's unconditioned. And then adding in the next part, which is the conditioned stimulus, that will be the bell. This thing, it's kind of like one of the tuning forks, but tuning fork, bell, just whatever can represent the conditioned stimulus. The bell is rang and the dog doesn't salivate. Nothing's happened yet because this is before conditioning. So then, while the conditioning is ongoing, the bell will be rang, and then the food will be presented, and then the dog will salivate. Over time, the dog will slowly start associating food with the bell because they are presented at the same time, which is the process of conditioning. And then after that, the bell is rang, the conditioned stimulus, which immediately causes the salivation because the dog knows to associate food with the sound of the bell. And the other type of conditioning is operant conditioning. Some basic terms are operant, which is a behavior or behaviors with environmental consequences. And then there's reinforcement twice, but that's because there's two types of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when a behavior is performed and rewarded with positive stimuli. And then negative reinforcement is the opposite, or not the opposite, but a behavior is performed and negative stimuli are removed. For a positive stimuli, an example would be if you have a kid who turns in his homework on time, you can reward the kid with candy, and that's a form of positive reinforcement. Or negative reinforcement, let's say, if you don't get your homework done, you have a curfew at 9:30. That'll be removed if you get your homework done, which is when that negative stimulus is removed. Now moving into the uses of conditioning. So it's good for teaching in a classroom setting, whether that's for memorization or just general classroom etiquette. Good for training animals. If anybody here has dog, cat, any other type of animal, rats are super smart. You can train them to perform tricks by giving them some kind of food incentive and then demonstrating the trick or whatever other techniques work for you. Then, of course, in a clinical psychologist's office, it's extremely common with different types of therapy to rewire the brain by using conditioning. It's good for developing habits. And lastly off, it's good for parenting. A lot of people will use conditioning without even realizing it as they become parents, or even if you're babysitting, you might notice that, just interacting with a child. Now, conditioning in clinical settings. So clinical settings, they are commonly used to rewire automatic negative thoughts in various types of therapy. And we will talk about the different types of therapy in a second. But the automatic negative thoughts will be removed when presented with this positive stimulus. Oftentimes, it'll be associating the memories with a happy place or something similar, just some kind of happy memory. And your therapist will work with you to associate the two stronger. DBT, dialectal behavioral therapy, and CBT both use conditioning. These are two very popular kinds of therapy, and conditioning applies as in rewiring the brain here, because it goes into several modules. There's mindfulness. I'm not going to get too much into that, though. And then lastly, undoing conditioning might be difficult depending on the intensity. You might have seen cases of abuse or neglect where the child has just been conditioned so much that the issue is deeply ingrained and extremely hard to undo. They might automatically do something like, let's say, 6 o'clock sharp, they'll automatically do the dishes, even if they aren't confined to that routine anyway, just because that's so deeply ingrained because of the negative and positive reinforcements associated, or the negative positive punishments. And conditioning also strengthens with time, as well as intensity. That's why breaking old habits is so hard. And then conditioning in clinical setting. Wait. There we go. So if you start to condition yourself, you might find it helpful for studying, your general routine, and motivation. If you condition yourself to study, you can do this in several ways. Maybe you reward yourself after reading a certain, completing a certain amount of reading, certain amount of math problems, etc., incentivizing yourself to get it done. Or you can condition yourself. This is a fairly popular one, but if you're studying, chew gum, and then during the test, chew that same gum, and the association will still be there. It's kind of a softer form of conditioning. It's more association than anything, but still good advice. And then routine. As long as you're consistent with your conditioning, lost me for a second. As long as you're consistent with your routine, then you're already doing conditioning on its own. If you consistently go to bed at 9 p.m. every night, your body starts to become conditioned to that and realize, okay, I need to start getting ready to sleep around that time. And then motivation kind of ties into studying, which we've talked about. And now on to conditioning yourself. This is fairly general, but it's still important to recognize the steps, and it could provoke some more discussion. Kind of a small crowd tonight, so won't won't be getting into too much discussion, but starting off, establish the goal and the type of conditioning you prefer. If operant conditioning works best for you, or if classical conditioning works best for you in that specific situation, great. Just consider the situation and consider what you know about yourself. So apply that conditioning terminology to your goal. If we go back, let's say that we're trying to work on our classical conditioning. So if we're trying to study more unconditioned stimulus, that might be the textbook. The unconditioned response, you might be tired, frustrated, etc. And then after that, you can bring the conditioned stimulus in. Let's say you reward yourself with a starburst or something after you complete a certain amount of math problems or after you finish the reading in that textbook. So you have the unconditioned stimulus, you're reading through the textbook, it makes you tired, cranky. Then the conditioned stimulus comes in, you have a starburst after every passage. And lastly, that will eventually provoke the conditioned response. Going back to the Pavlov's dog example, just since that's a bit of a better visual. We're in the third block now, which is when the conditioning is occurring. So the starburst is presented, then the textbook, which is the unconditioned, normally makes you angry. But the starburst will have a positive effect, so you really like them. So that will immediately override. You see the textbook, and then you automatically associate it with that starburst. So you'll have the positive unconditioned response in the future. And it takes a lot of time to go through that process. It's extremely complex, and the intensity matters, the time matters. If you keep yourself to it, and then going back over, talked about this, but be consistent and patient. It takes time to establish and strengthen. Or once again, if you're trying to undo conditioning, that also takes a lot of time. They always say old habits die hard, and that could be where that phrase comes from, in a way. Yeah, we don't have many people in the audience, but do we have any questions tonight? Could conditioning be used to stop addiction? Conditioning and addiction, that's a hard one. The thing is that it's more chemically dependent than anything. You couldn't just stop. I'm trying to think this one through. I'm sure it could be to an extent, but probably not on its own due to the strength of the addiction in the chemical part. Since the conditioning won't fix the neurotransmitters. Unless you're conditioning yourself to, other direction. Was a very good question, though. Do we have any other questions tonight? Either about conditioning overall, how it applies in the real world, or just any questions about psychology so far. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. Oh, are there other interesting conditioning studies? There's a few. Let me see if I can find one. On the contrary, it's really interesting to observe the undoing of conditioning. So I'm going to try to find an example for that. You can think of a lot of conditioning examples, but not the inverse. How's everyone doing tonight? Oh, PB&J, that's pretty good. I'm pretty good, thank you. I prefer tuna myself, but I can't find many undoing conditioning examples. Does anybody know of any? Pop them in the chat if you do. Besides the Pavlov's dogs. Like any of the inverse conditioning where you're removing it, besides the typical cases of abuse or trauma. And how have you guys used conditioning in your life before? It also helps to go back and reflect on that so you realize how important it really is. Did a science fair on it. Oh. Like, was it a study kind of science fair, or was it presenting the information? Either way, though, that's good. A lot of people aren't aware of how important conditioning is. Let's see. School has conditioned the ringing of a specific bell with the end of class for me. Oh. Yeah, I get that. Tested what motivation made my hamster dance best. Oh, that's funny. But yeah, conditioning is used all throughout our lives, every day. Even if you aren't thinking about it, you're either using it or it's being used on you. And with that being said, do we have any further questions? Kind of a short one today, but it's more of a review than anything. If not, then thank you guys for tuning in, and please reach out to me if you have any additional questions that you think of afterwards or just any feedback. Have a good day, everyone.